It's Friday night in October of 1993. And in Northern California, 3 junior high school girls are having a slumber party. Halloween is around the corner, and the girls have been trying on different costumes in preparation for the upcoming holiday. Within seconds, their lives will change forever. October 1st, Polly Klaas and Jillian Pelham were waiting for another friend outside of Polly's house in Petaluma, California. It was around 8:30 when Kate McLean and her mother showed up. The 3 girls were ready for fun. It was Friday night. There was ice cream in the fridge, and they were going to stay up all night long. This was going to be a party. No one had any idea of the danger that lurked so close by. The girls kept to Polly's bedroom, but they couldn't suppress the noise as easily. At about 9:45, Polly's mother, Eve Nickel, looked in on the girls and asked them to keep it down. She was suffering a migraine headache and thought she'd turn in early. Eve's bedroom was right across the hall from the girls, and although she had chided them about the noise, she was pretty sure it would only take a few minutes for the 12-year-olds to get noisy again. Before going to bed, Eve took her prescription pills to block out all distractions and get her fast to sleep.
Hold on, you guys.
The party continued on for almost an hour before the nightmare began. It was around 10:30 when the intruder entered the room. At first, Kate and Jillian thought it was a joke. Then they saw the knife. He told them if they screamed, he'd slit their throats. Immediately, he tied them up and started asking questions. He wanted to know which girl lived there and who else was in the house. Polly spoke up. The girls were terrified and crying, and he assured them that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that he was only there for money. But when Polly told him where some cash was hidden in a jewelry box, he made no attempt to find it. He gagged the girls and took the cases off some pillows to use as hoods. He made Polly get up and told the others to count to 1,000. By the time they were done, he said she'd be back. Then he took Polly Klaas and disappeared into the night. Petaluma police officers were called to the scene after the girls managed to free themselves and wake Polly's mother. They responded in minutes. Investigators entered Polly's room and began to look around. The bedroom was in disarray and told of the events that had happened just minutes before. On the floor were binding materials, cut strips of cloth. The cords from the Nintendo game had been cut, and a strap that was clipped from a purse lay on the floor. Pillowcases were strewn about.
I know.
What Petaluma Police Detective Mike Meese saw wasn't encouraging.
I remember standing at the doorway to Polly's room and looking at these few bags of evidence that we had been able to collect and thinking that that was just such a pitiful amount. And I looked down at the rug and I talked to my partner, Larry Pelton, and said, "Let's take the rug." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "I don't know why, but let's just take the rug. We just don't have enough evidence."
FBI.
Police were in desperate need of assistance. Fortunately, help was on the way. After being contacted by the Klaas family, the Federal Bureau of Investigation offered its expertise.
How about, have you all talked to the mother?
Yes.
Shortly after midnight, the FBI appeared at the house of Polly Klaas. Typically, the Bureau handles kidnappings, and with 800 a year to investigate, they have plenty of experience. Because he was familiar with the community and experienced in kidnapping cases, Special Agent Ed Fryer became the lead investigator. But he knew something about this case was different.
It had all the earmarks of a stranger abduction case because the statements from the two girls were consistent. Stranger abduction cases are the hardest cases to solve, in my experience, because, again, there's no connection between the perpetrator of the crime and your victim, or the victim's family, or somebody even associated to the victim. It's a random act.
Surprisingly, a vast majority of kidnappings involved disgruntled family members. And though Polly's parents were separated, her father, Mark Klaas, was immediately cleared of any responsibility. Abductions involving total strangers are exceedingly rare and leave little for investigators to go on. In this case, however, there were witnesses.
Was his hair long or short?
A police sketch artist was called in from the San Rafael Police Department. For 2 hours, Jillian and Kate tried to recall the face of the man who had barged into the bedroom. The girls were still terribly upset, but they managed to give the artist a pretty good description. Authorities now had their first idea of what the stranger looked like.
His nose and mouth.
After 4 a.m., the girls were taken to the police station, and the FBI called in one of its special forces, the Evidence Response Team. Tony Maxwell leads the crew.
In looking at cases across the United States, we have found that when somebody is kidnapped, especially a young child, that they will generally be harmed within the first 24 hours, and probably within the first couple of days could even be killed. So time is of the essence. In that kind of work, the investigator needs to move quickly.
The Evidence Response Team is designed to provide forensic resources at a major crime scene. Their sole responsibility is to collect evidence, and they use the most sophisticated collecting equipment available to do it. An electrostatic dust print machine collects tiny hairs and fibers off the floor when a positive charge is passed over a sheet of mylar. Any loose debris clings to the mylar and is sent to a lab for careful inspection. Although the police department had already dusted for fingerprints, they had come up with nothing particularly promising. But they didn't have access to the same equipment as the FBI. The alternate light source was a new method that employed a unique fluorescent powder, which when combined with a distinct ultraviolet light and amber-colored goggles, could illuminate many things that otherwise would remain hidden. The team found 4 dozen fingerprints the police were unable to see using conventional equipment. But even those were of no use. They were attributed to family and friends. After hours of meticulous searching, something finally turned up.
We're still working on it. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I have some ridge detail on the bedpost here. It looks like it's pretty good ridge detail.
A palm print that at the outset seemed like the first real piece of forensic evidence left behind at the scene.
That palm print was found on the bed, on a crossbar of a bed, where he apparently put his hand up for just a second to lean on it, perhaps to support himself as he was grabbing something. And with the alternate light source and the fluorescent fingerprint work that we did, we were able to see it, collect it, and then gather that for the laboratory.
At that time, the FBI's fingerprint database, AFIS, didn't contain palm prints, only fingerprints. But even a palm print won't catch a suspect. It will only identify one once he's captured. FBI Special Agent Mark Mershon explains.
People often think that when you have a fingerprint or a palm print that you quickly establish the identity of a criminal. The truth of the matter is, in most instances, you have to identify a suspect, have fingerprints for that suspect in order to compare with a latent fingerprint.
The hunt for the suspect prompted authorities to cover Polly's neighborhood inch by inch. By dawn, more than 100 agents and officers had begun a 24-hour search for Polly and her abductor. Helicopters and bloodhounds had been called out, and an all-points bulletin was issued by local authorities and the FBI. Systematically, the authorities searched every house in the neighborhood. Agents went to Polly's school to talk with teachers and students in the hopes that somebody might have some useful information. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood in pairs, asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious that night. One by one, they interviewed all of Polly's neighbors. Several people recalled seeing a stranger around the neighborhood that fit the description given by the girls. Thomas Georges and his friends were on their way to the video store at around 9 o'clock that night when he noticed a stranger standing in the shadows in front of Polly's house. Thomas knew everyone in his neighborhood, but he had never seen this man before. Returning home a few minutes later, the boys saw that the stranger was still there. The description Thomas gave to the authorities matched the suspect they were looking for. Sean Bush was playing video games with some friends who lived in a small rental cottage directly behind Polly's house. It was about 10:30 when Sean happened to glance out the window. He was surprised to see a strange man on the back porch of Polly's house. He appeared to be going for the back door. His description of the man also fit that of the suspect. There were others who saw the suspicious man that night, but unfortunately none of them alerted the authorities. As Petaluma Police Chief Patrick Parks explains, time was working against them.
In stranger abduction cases of small children, there is no more critical factor than time. Time is absolutely of the essence, and for that reason, you have to get out as many resources as you can. You have to put out the word as far as wide as you can. You have to involve as many agencies as you can, get them focused, get their efforts channeled, and hopefully, bring about a successful resolution.
While officers continued to comb the neighborhood, FBI investigators began executing the standard operating procedure in cases like these. After eliminating family and friends as suspects, they focused on ex-cons who were registered as sexual offenders throughout Sonoma County. Gradually, they branched out to surrounding counties, carefully questioning and investigating each registrant. But nothing turned up.
This is a hard case to believe that it even happened. There's 3 girls, they're in a slumber party. They're playing games in their bedroom, in their home, in a typical community, in a typical city. And somebody can walk into your home, the sanctity of the home, the security of your home, and take your daughter is if it wasn't impossible, was inconceivable.
The following day, the search for Polly Klaas had escalated into the largest manhunt in the nation. A massive community volunteer network was formed to assist authorities. While hundreds of citizens searched, others passed out flyers, trying to cover the entire city as quickly as possible. Back at the FBI's Trace Evidence Lab in Washington, D.C., forensic expert Chris Allen was carefully surveying the items collected from Polly's house.
I noticed that in untying the pieces of bindings, the thin nylon strips of bindings that were used to tie up Polly's girlfriends, that they had jagged edges to them. And I was able to line them up perfectly so that I was able to determine that these all came from one piece of cloth originally, and it was a piece of cloth like a lady's nightgown or a slip material.
Other pieces of evidence found in Polly's room were not so easy to classify. Tiny fibers collected with the electrostatic dust print machine proved to be a challenge to identify. After painstaking examination and comparison, Allen concluded that they had come from the interior carpet of an automobile. Eliminating the cars that could be accounted for at Polly's house, Allen suspected that these carpet fibers were most likely from the kidnapper's car. One more item Allen found was a little more personal to the suspect.
I found in the vacuuming of the area rug that was in Polly's bedroom that she was playing on with her girlfriends, a dark brown, forcibly removed head hair. And I say forcibly removed because it had a 3 or 4 millimeter root sheath on it, actually skin material that comes out of the scalp when the hair is forcibly pulled or yanked out.
If Polly had pulled a hair out of the suspect's head, it was evident that she didn't go without a struggle. But even a hair with DNA evidence couldn't bring investigators any closer to finding a suspect. The palm print lifted from the bedpost was sent to Michael J. Smith, a fingerprint specialist with the FBI. Examining the print under laser light, Smith determined that the print had enough ridge detail to photograph. But the light emitted from the laser turned the print orange, and Smith needed to capture a black print on a white background. He instructed the photographer to reverse the color so that the finished print would appear the way it would on a fingerprint card. Now the print was indelible and could be filed until a suspect was apprehended. Investigators had unearthed some solid evidence, but it wasn't enough. Time was running out, and Polly Klaas was still out there, somewhere. "48 hours after the abduction of Polly Klaas, her father, Mark, got a call.
Polly?
It sounded like Polly.
Okay, honey.
She told her father that she was in a hotel room somewhere, and that her abductor had stepped out for a moment.
Tell me where you are. Polly!
Then the
Polly!
line went dead. It offered the first glimmer of hope. But unfortunately, since Mark's line wasn't set up for a trace,
Detective Fryer,
all
please.
authorities could do was wait for another call. Word of the abduction spread rapidly. In 2 days, 50,000 flyers had been distributed. Community volunteers quickly organized a search command center to work in tandem with the police and FBI. It was an unprecedented grassroots effort. A telephone bank was manned 24 hours a day to field calls and tips. A copy of every lead that was phoned in was shared with the FBI and Petaluma police. Before long, the search center had screened 60,000 calls. Out of those, authorities were compelled to follow up on over 12,000 leads. Processing that amount of data would have been virtually impossible without help from an FBI computer processor.
The FBI just happened to have the Rapid Start team. It was a relatively new concept with the FBI, where on an investigation with a high volume of information, we would computerize that information, essentially triage the value of the investigative leads and make the assignments and track the progress.
Even with so many leads, there was one in particular that investigators were anxious to follow up on. When Mark Klaas received the first call, the FBI was powerless to do anything about it. The second time she called, they were ready.
Hello.
Like the previous call, it sounded like Polly,
How are you, honey?
and she could only talk for a short time before she had to hang up.
Where are you?
But it was long enough for authorities to make a trace.
Polly. Got it.
The FBI had traced the call to a house 30 miles away. There hadn't been enough time to collect an army of agents. The job would have to be handled by a few. But something wasn't right. This was just a normal family home. There was no sign of Polly or her abductor.
What's going on?
A terrible realization dawned on the agents. When they sat down with one of the girls in the house, she confessed to making the calls.
I'm sorry.
She admitted that friends from school had dared her to call and impersonate Polly.
I didn't know.
The entire incident had been a cruel joke.
This was the only indication we had after a week's time that Polly just might be alive still, and we all were poised and hopeful that this would yield a solution and her safe recovery. Of course, it didn't.
In mid-October, Kate and Jillian were brought in to give another description of the man who tied them up. A highly acclaimed forensic artist was flown in to make a second sketch.
It was pretty well cut.
The artist was known for relaxing witnesses enough to coax an accurate description from them. The girls were less stressed than they had been that night, and were able to give her more to work with.
No, they were
The second sketch was much more precise. This sketch looked like a person. New flyers were distributed immediately. There was no time to waste.
But if you look back at true stranger abductions, we have this rule of thirds. The children who are abducted, typically 1/3 are recovered alive, 1/3 are recovered dead, and 1/3 are simply never heard from ever again. That's what we faced in this particular investigation, and that, I think, was one of our motivations to keep the sustained effort up.
After a reward had been offered for Polly's return, authorities received a call demanding a $10,000 ransom. They traced the call to a Petaluma apartment building. This time a SWAT team showed up in force. They were not going to take any chances.
FBI! FBI! Come on! Down! 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 Sit down! 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 Man! Down! Down! Freeze! Cover! Cover!
Once again, authorities and the family had been fooled.
Put your hands behind your back. Don't move. Do not move. Going on. Don't move.
20-year-old James Hurd was arrested for attempted extortion and posing as a kidnapper. It was a crushing blow for everyone.
It became very frustrating. It was certainly distracting towards the main thrust of the investigation, but you had to deal with it. There was no way around it. You could not ignore those things. And it certainly chewed up a lot of time and resource.
The family had been especially discouraged. A letter Polly's parents wrote to the kidnapper was published in the October 17th San Francisco Examiner. Whoever you are, wherever you are, please return Polly to her family. She belongs here. We miss Polly so much. We miss the twinkle in her eye and her sweet humor. We long to see her beautiful smile and hear her musical voice. They also addressed Polly. Our darling, if you can read this, please know that your mommy and daddy love you so much, and we will continue to search for you until we can hold you safely in our loving arms again.
I don't think I ever lost hope. So I had numerous contacts with Mark Klaas, with Eve, with members of the family, and that was a question posed to me many times. And my response was no. We have not lost hope. We will not lose hope.
Across the country, people wanted to see Polly brought home. Banners sprang up, and Americans began a candlelight vigil. Thousands donned ribbons of lavender, Polly's favorite color, to show their support of the search.
We conducted searches during the day, during the night. We had a 24-hour operation going. We conducted searches sunny days, on foggy days, rainy nights. Whenever the information came in, we reacted to that because in a case like this, physical evidence is crucial.
The search never stopped. The Navy and search and rescue experts joined the thousands of volunteers who were constantly looking. Police and volunteer task forces worked tirelessly. But it would be nearly 2 months before anything broke. November 28th, 1993. It was 2 months after Polly Klaas was kidnapped that authorities got their first real lead. In Sonoma County, a sheriff's deputy was called out to the house of Dana Jaffe. It sat at the end of a long, winding drive off Pythian Road. Dana had been out inspecting her property when she noticed something unusual and thought it might be of use to investigators. She led the deputy through a densely wooded area to a clearing just a few yards from the long, winding drive to her house. Scattered in the woods were a few items that seemed somewhat suspicious. There was a large piece of silk cloth that had been fashioned into what appeared to be a hood. A couple of strips of packing tape were on the ground.
Yeah, it was about 2 months ago. We couldn't do anything about it. They ran his place.
A pair of young girl's tights had been tied into a knot, and human hair was entangled in the knot. Other debris surrounded the area. Then Dana recalled the night she'd caught a trespasser on her property not far from where they stood. It was nearly 2 months before. It all started when Dana's babysitter, Shannon Lynch, had left Dana's house and was making her way back down the long driveway. A man was walking down the middle of the private drive. His stranded Pinto was off to the side.
Get out of the car and help me.
He said that he was stuck and insisted that she get out of her car and help. He also wanted to know what was up the drive. But Shannon immediately sensed something wasn't right. She'd later describe him as looking like a wild man. She drove on, leaving him there, determined to get to a phone. Shannon found a payphone about 2 miles down the road and hurried to call her friend. She was anxious to get a hold of Dana and warn her of the scary man trespassing on her land. Dana didn't waste any time. She grabbed her daughter and a baseball bat and took off down the hill. She saw the car, like Shannon had said, but the strange man was nowhere in sight. She continued down into town and called the police. A few minutes after midnight, 2 Sonoma County Sheriff's deputies showed up. Dana explained that she didn't really want the intruder arrested for trespassing. She just wanted him off her property. The deputies found the trespasser, a little agitated. There was alcohol on his breath, and he was sweating profusely. There were bits of leaves and brush in his hair, as if he'd been rolling around on the ground. He told them that he'd been out sightseeing when he realized that he was on private property. When he tried to turn around, he got his car stuck on the side of the drive. He blurted out that he'd been under the car trying to free it, but the deputies didn't believe it. The way his car was trapped, there wasn't enough room for a person to get underneath. The deputies administered some roadside sobriety tests, but he passed them all. Looking in his car, they found some cans of beer in a plastic bag and a small duffel bag in the back seat. When they asked him if he'd been drinking, he actually opened a beer and began to drink it. They immediately made him pour it out and then told him they wanted to pat him down. He became extremely upset.
Leave me alone. Just keep that stuff away from me, all right?
To make him comply, the deputies told him they would be within their rights to run him in on trespassing. After he'd heard this, he calmed down considerably. They searched him carefully and continued questioning him, but could find nothing incriminating. He was just odd. The deputies remained suspicious, but when they ran his license, it checked out. His driving record was clean, and he had passed the sobriety tests. They had held him for about 45 minutes already, and they had no legal means to detain him any further. There was nothing left to do but pull his car out and send him on his way.
Well, those look like tights, and they look like...
That had been 2 months ago, the same night that Polly Klaas had been abducted.
Nothing good, that's for sure.
A hood, bindings, a young girl's pair of tights. It was too much of a coincidence. Putting it all together, the deputy quickly put a call in to the Petaluma Police Department.
Dispatch. I'm up here on...
Within an hour, Detective Mike Meese and Agent Ed Fryer arrived to check it out.
I'll never forget the scene. It was late at night then. By this time, Mike Meese and I are standing up on the hillside there on Pythian on the road. It was beginning to get a little misty and foggy, and the rain started to come down. And we looked at each other, and we knew in our hearts that we had basically uncovered a very critical crime scene, that this was going to lead us to the resolution of this case.
After the evidence was collected, investigators immediately began searching the Pythian Road site for any signs of Polly.
We spent days searching the mountain with over 300 volunteers. I believe we had 25 to 30 search dogs, and we conducted extensive ground searches for Polly, believing that she was still alive. which was the premise that we were working on.
As the search commenced, everything began to snowball. Authorities checked with the Sonoma County Police to get the full report of the incident that happened on Dana Jaffe's property. The man deputies had questioned was Richard Allen Davis. Accessing his criminal record revealed he had recently been paroled from an 8-year sentence for kidnapping.
What we learned about Davis initially was 1976 he had been arrested for robbery and kidnapping and assault with intent to commit rape. We learned in 1978 he had been arrested for another kidnapping, as well as a couple of counts of assault with a deadly weapon. 1984 he'd been arrested for a kidnapping case, assault with a deadly weapon, including the use of a firearm, and armed robbery. You start reading these reports and realize, you know, hey, this guy's a bad actor. This is an individual certainly more than capable of being involved in a crime like this.
The arrest photo on file matched the girl's description. His mother lived in Petaluma, giving him reason to have been there. The pieces were falling into place. The items discovered near Pythian Road were immediately flown to forensic specialist Chris Allen in Washington. Of the most interest was a strip of cloth that was found in the woods. Allen was quickly able to confirm what detectives had suspected.
Essentially what we're trying to do is establish whether or not the cut edges would line up or match. The middle strips represent the fabric that was found at Polly's bedroom, which were used to bind Polly's girlfriends. Subsequently, on the second submission, we received the cloth that was found at the Pythian Road site. These all fit together like a puzzle with the edges and the pieces of fabric matching up end to end.
The strips meant more than likely Polly Klaas had been out at Dana Jaffe's after her abduction. Without a doubt, Richard Allen Davis had been there too. Though it wasn't enough to arrest Davis for kidnapping, detectives felt if they could just get him in custody, they could quickly gather the evidence they needed to tie him to Polly's disappearance.
Everything else fell away, and we focused on what we had with Mr. Davis, what happened out there at Pythian Road, and what we were going to do next.
When investigators discovered Davis had an outstanding warrant for breaking parole and DUI, they decided to bring him in. But he wasn't at home when they arrived. Then a deputy sheriff who was securing a perimeter around the area stopped a van. At the wheel was Richard Allen Davis. When the deputy realized who he had, he calmly called it in to the investigators back at the house.
Is there a problem, officer?
No, sir. Just sit tight, okay?
Authorities reported to the scene, and Detective Meese approached the van and asked Davis to step out.
Step out of the van?
He informed him that he was under arrest for violation of his parole.
No. I'm Detective Meese. I'm arresting you for
One thing I think it's important to understand how Richard Allen Davis was taken in custody, because it was such a low-key event, and because Mike Meese went ahead and handcuffed him. He did it in a very professional way, and he started a rapport going with Richard Allen Davis that later was very useful in bringing resolution to the case.
It had been 2 months since Kate and Jillian had seen the man who took Polly Klaas, but they had no trouble picking him out of a lineup.
Number one, step forward, please.
Even without the beard, his was a face they could never forget.
Number one, step back, please.
Though he'd been arrested for parole violation, Davis was questioned about the kidnapping. He vehemently denied any involvement, but authorities let Davis know that if he wanted to talk, the door was open.
So I took Davis into the hallway and I told him, I said, hey, look, what you need to know is we've got all the physical evidence it takes to make this case. And all you're looking at is a kidnapping right now. So if you want to talk about it, you got to let me know. And he made a non-committal response, didn't want to talk. And I remember patting my pockets looking for a business card, didn't have a business card with me. And I said, you know, I'm going to leave my name and number with those guys, meaning the correctional deputies. And if you ever want to talk about it, you know, give me a call.
Back at the FBI latent fingerprint lab, Mike Smith was comparing the palm print found in Polly's bedroom with one that had been taken from Davis since his arrest. This was a crucial piece of evidence. Matching the two prints would undoubtedly link Davis to the abduction. After careful examination, the results were called in to Agent Fryer.
I just got a call from FBI laboratory. They matched Davis's palm print to a palm print taken off of Polly's bedroom, or her bedpost. It was again one of those moments where there's butterflies in my stomach. Again, realized that this was really very powerful evidence. So I hung up the phone, and again there was a lot of noise and commotion in the command post. I stood up and I asked everybody, "Can I have your attention, please? Can I have quiet for a moment?" I said, we just got confirmation from our laboratory that we've matched this palm print taken from the bedroom to Davis. We can place him in the bedroom. And there was just a huge cheer from everybody. Papers were flying. It was just great news to everybody.
This is it. It's concrete. He was in her bedroom. We can prove it. We had him nailed down.
Though news of the matching print had gone public, Davis was being held in isolation and had not heard anything about it. Then one day, a friend of his showed up for a visit. He urged Davis to talk to authorities and tell them where Polly was. But Davis continued to deny responsibility. Then his friend gave him the news the rest of the nation had already heard. It came as a complete surprise. Davis realized it was going to be impossible to explain how his palm print got in Polly's bedroom. There was only one thing he could do.
In Davis's mind, he's now got to do something, and that is try to make whatever deal he can make with the authorities, because we know that he was in Polly's bedroom. We can put him there.
While on his way to the massive search for Polly near Pythian Road, Detective Meese was paged to call the jail. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, and Meese was anxious about what he might find out.
After this wait, you know, Davis comes on the phone, and I recognize the voice. So I know it's him, and I said, he says to me, he says, "Hey, I screwed up. I screwed up big time."
Detective Meese and Special Agent Larry Taylor met with Davis in the interrogation room, where Davis related the details of the night of October 1st. Though he was living in something like a halfway house, he had applied for an overnight pass to go visit his mother in Petaluma. Unable to find her house, he had a few beers and walked the streets of Polly's neighborhood. At one point, he was stopped by a man who wanted to sell him some marijuana. He decided to go ahead and buy the joint. In Davis's own words, he got really buzzed and went to the store for more beer. He soon found himself wandering the neighborhood aimlessly. He wasn't sure where he was or what he was doing. But Davis had come to the neighborhood prepared. He'd brought a bag packed with bindings and tape. Forensic experts were able to determine that he had cut the strips with a pair of scissors, a fact which implies intent. Then Davis said he randomly picked a house on the street and crawled into an open window. He remembered hearing TV voices and said he may have picked up a knife from the kitchen. He said he didn't remember anything after that. He claimed the next thing he knew, he was driving in his car and was surprised to find a young girl sitting next to him. She was complaining that her hands were tingling. According to Davis, he adjusted the straps for her and drove around wondering what he had done and what he should do next. Then he drove off the side of the road and got the car stuck. Once he realized he was stuck for good, he says he got Polly out of the car and carried her up a steep embankment about 30 yards away.
Get out of the car!
He planned to leave her in the darkness until he could figure out a way to free the car. The rest of Davis's story about what happened at Pythian Road matched the witnesses' accounts. At the time of the incident, the bulletin about Polly's abduction was just going out over police radios. But the deputies were tuned to a different frequency and would not have heard it even if they had been in their cars. They ran his license, but the equipment they had at that time was only able to give a cursory printout of Davis' driving record. It couldn't generate his criminal record. They found nothing they could hold him on.
What I want you to do is, all right, I'm gonna follow my finger.
Davis recalled how the deputies pulled his car out and escorted him to the main highway. But he claims that he waited for 15 or 30 minutes and returned to the site to find Polly. Then he just drove around. At some point, he realized he had to get rid of her. At long last, authorities had found out what they'd been desperate to know. Polly Klaas was dead, and Richard Allen Davis was the man responsible. Davis agreed to take them to the site in a deserted area of Cloverdale where he had left the body. It was night, but inspectors felt the need to confirm Davis's story couldn't wait until daybreak. He led them to a field near an abandoned lumber mill. Out in the field, under some boards, investigators found the body of Polly Klaas.
It was an odd feeling. You're in the presence of somebody like Davis, and just a few yards away is what's left of a very beautiful, innocent 12-year-old.
The Polly Klaas case was special because people cared. Because the whole community stepped forward and said, this is the last child you're going to take, and that this is our child, and that we are going to go out and look for her until we find her.
The case wouldn't come to trial until 1996. But after 10 weeks in the courtroom, a jury found Davis guilty on 10 counts, including kidnapping, robbery, burglary, murder, and attempting to commit a lewd act on a child. The latter charge Davis continued to deny during the entire trial. Investigators strongly believed that despite Davis's testimony, Polly was already dead at the time deputies helped him with his car. He was sentenced to death and continues to sit on death row at San Quentin Prison. Polly Klaas left behind a legacy to save other lives. The way missing persons cases are handled has changed forever since the investigation. Law enforcement databases are linked to different agencies providing vital information to multiple jurisdictions. Missing persons bulletins are now sent out over all police channels. At routine pullovers and traffic stops, officers can access not only driving histories, but criminal records as well. Implementation of the 3 strikes you're out legislation was a direct result of the case, as was the push to expedite the appeals process in murder cases. And a foundation established in Polly's name aids the search for missing children.
It looked just a little fuzzy on the website.
Involvement of the FBI was critical to bringing resolution to this case. Had they not come in and gotten involved early on, it's doubtful we would ever have had resolution, or certainly that it would have been as quickly as it was, even though it seemed like a long time.
The unique partnership that was formed between local police and the FBI set a precedent that continues to this day. In 1989, residents of a close-knit apartment community in Virginia gathered for a holiday celebration. For Tammy Brannen and 5-year-old daughter Melissa, Christmas was always a special time. Then, without warning, the little girl was gone. Her disappearance ignited an impassioned search. Law enforcement and the local community spared no effort. But would they piece together the evidence and find her before it was too late?
In 1989, in front of close to 200 witnesses, a child disappeared. 5-year-old Melissa Brannen vanished from a Christmas party at her mother's apartment complex in Virginia. Children have a way of wandering off, but it soon became clear this was more than a case of a lost child. Someone had taken Melissa. What sorrow compares to a mother's grief? What kind of monster preys on children? I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. The hunt for Melissa galvanized the community as a nation held its breath and waited for word. All victims deserve justice. All criminals must be punished. But when a crime involves a child, the stakes become so much greater.
On December 3rd, 1989, the Woodside apartment complex in Lorton, Virginia held its Yuletide Christmas party. The Woodside was a large but friendly complex, a community that revolved around family life and children's activities. The kids were always excited about the party, which meant special treats and presents. A single mom, Tammy Brannen, had found in the Woodside complex a safe community in which to raise her only child, Melissa. As the evening wound down, Tammy stopped to visit with a friend before going home.
We'll have some pizza. How about that? Okay? Can I go get some potato chips?
Okay, we'll come right back.
Okay.
I'm distracted now with those. Really? Mm-hmm. Good for you. Yeah. Did you?
We gotta get ready.
Okay.
We have a lot to do.
She's getting so big.
So cute. She is.
Did you see where she went?
She lost sight of her daughter for only a few seconds. But that was long enough for a mother's worst nightmare to begin.
Do you see my daughter? Melissa? Melissa? Melissa!
Melissa disappeared. The Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department was called immediately.
Now, I'm going to do
do everything I can to find your little girl, but you have to tell me everything you can possibly.
Detective Bill Wilden assured Tammy they would do all they could to find her little girl. The detectives began questioning the people at the party. No one could recall seeing Melissa leave the party or anywhere near the front door.
I'm Detective Wilden. This is Rappaport with the
Richard Rappaport, the Fairfax Department search commander, joined Detective Wilden to organize the search party.
If you come across anything suspicious, an article
He would head up
closing,
the investigation.
Does everyone understand?
One of the possibilities, of course, was that she had just hidden somewhere in the building, was playing with some friends, or had wandered off. So immediately the patrol officers on the scene did a very good job of searching the building, and they began a search of the immediate area surrounding the building. The night of December 3rd was a bitterly cold night in the Washington area. Someone outside that was 5 years old without a lot of protection probably would not have survived through the night. It was that cold.
All the adults that can participate, I need you outside with flashlights.
Rappaport coordinated a more specific grid search of the area with patrol officers and dozens of volunteers from the complex.
Let's go.
The search effort began. Nearly 100 neighbors, police, and Army personnel from nearby Fort Belvoir combed the woods around the complex. Most were parents themselves, united by a single concern: to find Melissa. Like the detectives, they expected to find a shivering and frightened little girl lost in the dark woods and crying for her mother. Officers began to question the 200 people who had attended the party and interview over 400 other Woodside residents. Though the complex was large, many residents knew Melissa and knew her to be very shy. Shocked to hear that she had disappeared, almost all expressed doubt that she would ever have gone off without her mother, and certainly not with a stranger. Detective Wilden went with Tammy to her apartment to interview her. He questioned her extensively about her past and possible troubles with her neighbors or employer. An accountant, she had never had any problems with anyone. Tammy had lived at Woodside for over 3 years since her divorce from her husband in Texas. She had experienced the normal readjustments of a newly single mom, but she and her ex-husband were on good terms. When detectives discovered an open window in the furnace room, Jim Gogan, the crime scene investigator for the Fairfax County Police Department, was asked to examine it.
Right through here? The way the door was set up, everybody had to either go through the crowd to get out the front of the building. That was only the main door and the only door available to get out, with the exception of the hallway down to the bathrooms and the furnace room. They had large windows, and in the furnace room itself had a window, what was discovered open. And from there, the assumption was made that possibly that's how she was taken from the building.
Melissa's disappearance was suddenly far more complicated. The search for a missing child had become a possible abduction case.
Did you see her leave the party at any time?
The police continued their questioning with even greater urgency and began to hear repeated mention of the strange, even bizarre behavior of the maintenance man for the complex.
That was the last I saw.
What was his height?
Several of the women reported how offended they were by extremely vulgar sexual propositions made to them by Caleb Hughes.
There was a possibility that if she had been abducted for sexual purposes, that she might be molested, but we were very, very hopeful that we could at least find her alive before her life was in jeopardy.
Now that they were dealing with a possible abduction case, detectives returned to Tammy's apartment and collected nightgowns, hairbrushes, and bedclothes, any items bearing traces of Melissa.
Can you describe?
As detectives continued questioning the people at the party, they learned more disturbing details about Hughes' behavior that night. He had spent what seemed to many to be an unusual amount of time playing games with the children. He made the parents uneasy by touching the kids. There was something unsettling, something indecent about him.
At the party, he was not dressed as well as the rest of the people. He wore his work clothes. He mingled with some of the people he knew at the party, and he spent some time talking with Melissa's mother, making comments about Melissa, and offered to take Melissa and a couple of other children to the restroom if they needed to go. He just had some very suspicious behavior from a man of his age around the children.
With growing suspicion, the detectives tried repeatedly to reach Hughes by phone, and then went to his house, but were told by his wife that she had no idea where he might be.
Were you playing with her tonight?
He had left the party sometime before our arrival there. He lived only 4 miles away, but it took us several hours for us to contact him because he had not yet returned home.
Finally, 2.5 hours after Melissa's disappearance, Caleb Hughes called the police, who then returned to his house.
I'd like to know.
Upon questioning, he claimed he had simply taken the long way home. The officers immediately noticed he was wearing different clothing from that reported by witnesses at the party.
I washed clothes tonight when I got home.
Where did you see 'em?
They're in the washing machine over there.
In the washing machine, they found the clothes Hughes had been wearing, as well as his sneakers and a leather belt with a knife sheath. The knife was missing.
You washed your shoes at 2 a.m. in the morning?
Here.
He'd been gone for several hours, and to come home in the middle of the night when your family was asleep and to feel the immediate need to wash everything you had been wearing, including your shoes, we found that rather suspicious behavior, and that just further added to our interest in his whereabouts.
As Hughes appeared reluctant to speak in front of his wife, the officers decided to take him to headquarters for further questioning. Suspecting that Hughes might be covering for time spent with a girlfriend, the officers wanted to allow him the opportunity to tell the real story.
Do you know Melissa Brannen?
No, I do not.
To the detective's surprise, there was no real story. Hughes had no alibi. He claimed he had no idea who Melissa was, that he had driven the long way home
Why were you
alone
washing your
after
shoes?
picking up a six-pack, and then had simply washed his clothes.
You normally wash your shoes with your clothes?
Sometimes, yeah.
What were they dirty with?
He said as an excuse that they were his only work clothes and he had to be to work the next day and they were dirty, so he needed to clean them for work.
Look, am I being charged with anything?
Despite hours of intense questioning, Hughes remained smug and evasive.
I'm free to go.
Finally,
Yeah, you're free to
Detective
go.
Wilden told him he was free to go,
But I know you're
though he
guilty.
was almost certain Hughes was lying.
Well, you're gonna have to prove it then, aren't you?
As far as the Fairfax County Police Department was concerned, Caleb Hughes was the prime suspect. Believing Caleb Hughes was involved in Melissa's disappearance, Detective Bill Wilden contacted Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney Robert Horan.
It was a suspected homicide, certainly by then. He made some statements that were out of character for somebody who really is a suspect in a crime of this nature. You would normally think the minute somebody would suggest you or I have abducted a 5-year-old child,
Look, am I
I
free
mean,
to
you
go?
would think it would be
Am I
the
being
most
charged?
vigorous, vehement outburst. Of course I didn't. Well, they got nothing like that. Matter of fact, at one point he said to Wilden, "Prove it," which is again an unusual reaction for somebody who had nothing to do with it.
Gauguin had photocopied Melissa's picture and printed hundreds of flyers to help in the search.
And as the sun came up, the search expanded into further down south on the highway. They sent soldiers out to do massive searches through the woods, along the railroad tracks, and as possible ideas of locations where she might have been were developed, again, hundreds of people were gathered to search and walk those areas.
The car Hughes had been driving that night belonged to his wife. She gave investigators permission to impound and search it. Detectives examined it for fingerprints, blood, fibers, hair, any evidence that would document Melissa's presence there. Fingerprint tests revealed that only the Hughes family had left prints on the car. Next, all the hairs and fibers needed to be collected from the interior. This type of trace evidence was usually retrieved with a vacuum cleaner, but there was simply too much debris inside.
When I first approached the car and looked inside, I just kind of went, whoa. They had 2 large dogs, the Hughes. They carried them a lot in that car. It was just cluttered with dirt and debris and just a mess inside that car. And I just kind of shook my head like this was going to be a real challenge. So I decided to use the masking tape as an alternative to the vacuum cleaner, just hoping to just get what was on the surface.
That was an unusual technique, certainly. In my years, that was the first time I ever had run into it in the Fairfax Police Department. And it's a very common technique now.
Gauguin then placed the tape between layers of clear plastic so that it could be examined intact under a microscope. As the car processing continued, Melissa's disappearance quickly became the lead news story in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area.
Melissa Brannen is 3 feet tall, 48 pounds, with blue eyes and dark blonde, shoulder-length hair. She was last seen wearing a pink ski jacket, red plaid skirt, and black shoes with gold buckles.
The night of the party, Melissa had been wearing a navy blue acrylic sweater with a Sesame Street Big Bird picture, red tights, a red cotton plaid skirt, and a pink parka.
When I found the red and blue fibers that were visible on the tape, I did kind of get excited about that. But at the time I was excited but worried because we needed to find her to identify the clothes, the possible clothes. Without Melissa, that was going to be real tough.
When Gauguin conducted luminol testing on the interior of Hughes's car, he found traces of blood on the steering wheel, brake pedal, and floor mat. When a light is shined on the luminol-treated area, bloodstains will appear fluorescent. While the luminol process is quite accurate as a blood locator, it can also destroy the genetic characteristics of the sample.
When I sprayed the steering wheel, I got the reaction on the steering wheel and as well as on the pedals of the vehicle. That's where it fell to. These items were swabbed and collected.
Hughes's shoes had been washed, but the lab was able to identify possible bloodstains on their soles where fresh cuts had been made.
It became very suspicious when I received the clothes from the officers who searched the house and noticed that he had cut his tennis shoes. Kind of putting 2 and 2 together, that why was he cutting his tennis shoes and why did I get a reaction to blood on the gas pedals?
Surely Caleb Hughes had tried to cover his tracks to avoid a link to an unimaginable crime.
What is your name? Caleb Hughes. How old are you?
With the luminol findings showing blood in his car, the detectives were increasingly confident they could get a confession from Hughes. He was brought in for a polygraph test. He had no explanations for the fresh cuts on his shoes.
No.
Once again, he gave no explanation for the 2-hour, 30-minute delay in getting home.
But as it turned out, there never was an explanation. He said, I just took the long way home. It was the best they got.
Did you harm Melissa Brannen? No. Did you kill Melissa Brannen? No. These are proven to be deceptive.
When Hughes denied outright that he had killed Melissa, polygraph examiner Rick Danielle was sure he was lying.
He really denied ever having seen this child, denied knowing who the child was. He was showing pictures of her, never seen that child before. And of course the police knew that was not true. because he had been at the same table with the child, had talked to the child.
You got the wrong guy. I'm asking about what you did. You got the wrong guy.
Danielle was absolutely satisfied he was hiding something, that he was lying about something.
I'm out of here.
He was attempting to deceive him. But of course, none of that under Virginia law, as you may know, none of that's evidence. You're not allowed to use it at trial.
Investigators were convinced Hughes had abducted and harmed the beautiful little girl. But Tammy Brannen tried to keep her hope alive, fighting her worst fears. Melissa's Christmas presents waited under the tree.
News 7 has confirmed tonight that the investigation into the disappearance of 5-year-old Melissa Brannen appears to be focusing on one primary suspect. Police will continue their search efforts and to pursue leads. There is now a $10,000 reward for any information concerning Melissa's whereabouts.
For Tammy Brannen and her parents, the hours passed in an agonizing wait for more information. Melissa's disappearance electrified the tiny rural community of Lorton, a suburb of Washington, D.C. Only 5 months earlier, 10-year-old Rosie Gordon had been bike riding in her neighborhood when she was abducted, raped, and murdered. Her killer had never been found.
Nice to meet you too.
Rosie's mother quickly came to Tammy Brannen's support.
The yellow ribbons that punctuate trees and balconies at the Woodside apartment complex in Lorton have weathered
Once Melissa's
3
disappearance was
snowstorms.
reported
They've
on the
held their
news,
position
the community
fear
rushed
and
to her support.
speculation as to the
Yellow
whereabouts
ribbons
of
began
5-year-old
appearing on
Melissa
Christmas
Brannen.
trees throughout the area.
By all indications, Tammy was a wonderful mother, very loving mother, very, very protective of her child. Melissa was her only child, and I just think all those facts together struck a chord that virtually anyone could identify with those circumstances, and people's hearts went out to the Brannen family.
Hundreds of people volunteered to post flyers throughout the region and assist the local authorities in their search. A new expert was also brought into the search effort. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children sent John Gold, one of their search and rescue consultants.
We are legislated into being as the state clearinghouse for all the information regarding missing persons. And we also assist families and law enforcement kind of as a liaison between the two, working as many cases as we can.
After debriefing, Gold and his partner went directly to the apartment complex clubhouse.
Check a stride out here.
Outside, they found adult male footprints leading from the furnace room window to a split rail fence whose top rail had recently been broken.
We began to find transferences on the other side of the fence into a small parking lot there beside the clubhouse, in the parking lot, I think, with an abandoned restaurant or some type of building there. And that's where the track stopped.
Straight through here, over this fence.
Right from the beginning, we found the adult footprints, but we never found a child's footprints. So we felt comfortable that if that was the abductor we were looking for, and we felt pretty comfortable that it was, that Melissa was probably being carried even from outside the window, was being carried by the abductor to the point where she and the abductor got in the vehicle.
But where would Hughes have taken her?
I don't know.
Detectives received a lucky break when they interviewed Hughes's wife.
She had been somewhat suspicious that he might go somewhere else after work. She didn't want him to go anywhere except to work and directly back home. And so unbeknownst to him, she had made a note of what the mileage was. And the following day told us that she had checked the mileage again and that 12 miles had been put on the car. We now had another piece of possible information about the extent to which he could have gone that night. We first marked the location of the crime. This was the apartment complex in southern Fairfax County. We next located Caleb Hughes's residence, which was in northern Prince William County, roughly in this area. We then took a string that was the equivalent of 12 linear miles and tied the two ends of the string together and placed them over the pins. So we simply took a pencil and defined that area so that any point at the end of that string represented the outer limits of the search that was conducted on December the 8th.
I think with the truth that you're going to be able to supply
Within 3 days of Melissa Brannen's disappearance, investigators had organized a 25-square-mile joint search with the Army, Police Department, Civil Air Patrol, and Coast Guard. Over 500 volunteers turned out for the effort.
We have a 12-mile radius that we need to cover.
Black patent leather shoes, with gold bows, and clean fitted jacket.
We had dozens of search teams that were comprised of trained law enforcement people, civilian volunteers, and military personnel. They were doing step-by-step searches of defined areas. Each area had been broken down and was assigned to a team.
We're going to be looking for the clothing a lot. That's going to be one of the main things.
They had specific instructions on how to search. If they found anything which they thought might be evidence, they were to mark it, not to disturb it, and we had teams of crime scene people who would then respond to that particular location and process the evidence.
At this point, we've not found anything today that puts us any closer than we were this morning.
The volunteers were frustrated and extremely disappointed.
I know there were nights when I would go home and my family would have seen a newscast about another day of searching, and my own children would say, "Daddy, are you going to find that little girl? When are you going to find that little girl?" And I think that was a conversation that was occurring in the homes of dozens of investigators and police officers involved in this case.
While the search continued, Gogan approached the nearby FBI lab with the evidence he had processed from the car. Because Melissa was still missing, the FBI's state-of-the-art technology would be critical in establishing the connection between the hair, fibers, and bloodstains collected and Melissa Brannen. Agent Doug Diedrich of the FBI's Trace Evidence Unit would examine the evidence. Perhaps he could find a link to Melissa Brannen.
There you have to go to extraordinary measures to try to recreate, if at all possible, the environment of the victim, most recent environment, and also the types of hairs that the victim may have, the type of clothing that the victim may have been wearing the night of the disappearance. And that's the difficult part.
As long as Melissa was still missing, filing charges against Caleb Hughes was all but impossible unless compelling evidence could be found. Diedrich and the lab examiners were impressed by the large number of fibers that had transferred onto the passenger seat of Hughes's car. Fairfax County investigators had identified nearly 70 different fibers.
That included the blue acrylic fibers, the red cotton fibers, the black rabbit hairs, and there were, I believe, 1 or 2 head hairs in the case. But that's monumental. Sounds like a small number. That's huge.
Once the FBI entered the case, its agents conducted their own investigation of Hughes's house. When Caleb Hughes's name was released as the primary and only suspect in the case, a media frenzy followed.
Hughes has not been charged in the case, but he is the target of round-the-clock surveillance by the FBI. Federal investigators working with police from Fairfax County last night executed a search warrant on the groundskeeper's rented townhouse. They recovered several items which have been taken to the FBI laboratory to be tested to see if there is any evidence linking this man to Melissa. In the meantime, the FBI's official comment is no comment.
The FBI brought the power of a federal grand jury to the investigation. The grand jury ordered Hughes to submit to blood and other forensic tests, something the local authorities had not been able to order. Hughes complained bitterly in interviews that his life had been ruined by the invasion. Details of a troubled past emerged. Hughes grew up in an abusive, dysfunctional home. He had a record as a juvenile delinquent, a long history of drug and alcohol abuse, and a disturbing attraction toward children.
As an adult, he had been convicted of larceny. He had been convicted of car theft. He had been convicted of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The evidence indicated that he did spend a lot of time with young children, nobody the age of Melissa Brannen, but certainly a lot of children in their early teens.
In the lab, FBI examiners had begun analyzing the stains on the soles of Hughes's shoes. Though luminol testing had damaged the samples taken from Hughes's car, they became increasingly convinced that these minute traces contained blood serum proteins that could determine the crucial connection to Melissa.
This blood's been...
The samples were submitted for DNA and serology tests.
Make that for a slide, for sure.
15 days after Melissa's abduction, a candlelight vigil for Melissa was held at the apartment complex. The little girl's disappearance had united the Fairfax community in compassion and outrage.
And during that whole Christmas season of 1989, that every night on the 6 o'clock news, you saw the video shot that her grandfather had taken of Melissa Brannen. And I'm sure I was like many people in the metropolitan area of Washington who felt that they knew her from seeing this lovely child every night on television.
But shortly after New Year's, a judge in the next county received a letter from Hughes's probation officer informing him that Hughes had violated probation for an auto theft conviction 2 years earlier. On January 24th, the judge revoked Hughes's probation, and he was finally put behind bars. The earliest he could be released was November, giving the Fairfax County prosecutor ample time to build his case. Without sufficient evidence to file charges, Hughes had remained free. But now, with Hughes safely put away, the FBI had the time needed for the extensive testing required by the trace evidence. There was still a chance Melissa's body might be found, but without it, the case against Hughes would have to be made in the FBI lab. Already, FBI examiner Doug Diedrich had found his first big break in the case.
I remembered some black animal hairs in the debris from the front seats of the car. And in looking through the little girl's nightshirt, I noticed these similar black hairs sticking out of the nightshirt. So it just rang a bell. I went back, mounted those up on slides and compared them, and sure enough, dyed rabbit hair, and they matched each other.
The rabbit hairs from Hughes's car and those found on Melissa's nightgown both revealed a distinctive corncob texturing. An exact microscopic match. Agent Diedrich immediately called the prosecutor to determine whether Tammy Brannen owned a rabbit fur coat. Not only was it confirmed that Tammy Brannen owned a rabbit fur coat, she had worn it to the Christmas party. Her mother had bought it in Germany, and it was dyed an extremely rare bluish-black color almost unknown in the United States. Melissa had handled the coat at the party and at home. Diedrich had made the crucial connection between Melissa and the car of Caleb Hughes.
So you not only, you tied those rabbit hairs, you tied that match not only to the fur coat of her mother, you tied it to the front seat of the car, but you also tied it to the child's environment itself, the rabbit hairs on the shirt of the child.
To me, that was a significant point in the case, because then it starts pushing me in the direction of we might have something. And from there, it was a matter of digging some more, see if I couldn't find some additional fibers that may be of value. So I started digging a little bit more, starting looking a little closer, asking questions of myself, asking questions of the evidence, because it's speaking. Strange, but it's speaking to me.
As week after week passed, Melissa's name eventually disappeared from the news. Life in Fairfax County had returned to normal, but Tammy Brannen was still no closer to finding her child.
it's tremendously difficult for the family to come to terms with everything that has gone on, to come to terms with still trying to hold on to that glimmer of hope that their child's alive, and then the realization that in all likelihood, they may never find their child alive or may never find the body of their child even after they've been murdered.
Tammy was forced to face the reality that by now, there was almost no chance Melissa could still be alive.
We wanted to close this case and not just close the case in the sense of identifying and prosecuting a suspect, but we wanted to bring real closure to the case in answering the question, what happened to Melissa Brannen that night? Why did it happen?
Such questions plagued Tammy Brannen. Depressed and unable to work, she remained secluded in her apartment, waiting. Agent Diedrich had examined the blue acrylic and red cotton fibers in the passenger seat evidence collected by Jim Gogan. At first glance, they appeared to match descriptions he had been given of the red tights and big bird sweater Melissa wore that night. But without a duplicate outfit to make an exact fiber comparison, he was at a dead end.
And so I went home, spoke to my wife. Of course, she straightened me out right away that if it had a big bird on it, it wasn't Winnie the Pooh, and it had to be sold at JCPenney's, having young kids of my own about the same age.
Diedrich asked his wife if she kept any old JCPenney catalogs in the house from the last few years. She said she knew she had a Christmas catalog.
Teased me about being a pack rat. I think
Diedrich was astonished to find a picture of an outfit that exactly matched the description of that worn by Melissa.
JCPenney's catalog. I collected it 2 years ago at Christmas.
Oh, great.
The FBI contacted JCPenney, and the store began a search of its records. For more than 2 months, Tammy Brannen had anxiously waited by the phone for some kind of information or word about her daughter.
Where is she?
Then, completely unexpectedly, she received a phone call. A man's voice told her he was holding Melissa for ransom and that she must deliver $75,000 the next day, or her little girl would be seriously hurt.
Can I talk to her?
Had Melissa been found?
Yes. Yes.
The national statistics will tell you that a child who's abducted by a stranger is usually dead within 3 hours of the abduction. So the likelihood of Melissa being alive months after the abduction is extremely slim.
Mom, they have Melissa.
Tammy immediately called her mother, but Detective Wilden cautioned them not to let their hopes get too high.
No, don't call anyone. I'll tell you all about it. Just come over right now.
Once again, Melissa Brannen was about to become front-page news. Detective Wilden had instructed Tammy Brannen to cooperate with the ransom demands in the hopes her daughter would be recovered alive. As extortion falls under federal guidelines, the FBI coordinated the ransom drop. The FBI SWAT team was ready when 2 young men showed up in the parking lot to pick up the money.
I see him getting ready to open up the door. I got the bag. Go. Here we go. FBI, freeze!
They were quickly arrested. But did they have Melissa in their possession?
The information provided in the ransom call was so vague and so generalized, it's entirely possible that the person who called may have picked up that information simply by watching the news or reading the newspaper. Usually if there's a ransom demand that is legitimate, they're going to have very specific information that would be known only to the abductor and probably some of the investigators.
The 2 arrested youths were former students and roommates from a nearby university who had seen an opportunity to make some easy money out of Tammy Brannen's tragedy. They were convicted of 5 counts, including conspiracy and extortion, in the United States District Court in Alexandria, Virginia.
Turned out to be just a terrible hoax. I mean, just terrible. The notion that you would do that deliberately to a mother who was going through what she was going through.
There were copious amounts of dog hairs in the tape samples collected by Fairfax County crime scene investigator Jim Gogan, as well as dozens of human hairs. FBI lab examiners separated and painstakingly subjected each one to testing. Finally, a hair was found that was different from the others. The hair was a very light blonde, the only one of its type found in the vehicle, but it was an exact match with the hairs found in Melissa's hairbrush. Matching the human hair with Melissa was the second big match for Diedrich. But the critical link of Melissa's clothes to the fibers from Hughes's car was incomplete without a duplicate Big Bird outfit to analyze. Because it had been a special Christmas outfit, produced only once, it could not be found in stock. JCPenney gave the FBI a list of people who had purchased the outfit from its catalog division.
They then sent FBI agents out across the country to locate those people and determine if they still had the Big Bird outfit that they had bought from the JCPenney catalog, and ultimately they were able to locate a sample outfit from a family that still had the outfit.
Obtaining the outfit could mean the difference between conviction and acquittal in the case. The FBI asked the family traced through the JCPenney records to send it to their crime lab.
Well, I remember that day pretty clearly. I knew the outfit was coming in. The fiber color, according to the color in the catalog, was navy blue, but the fibers that I was finding were sort of purplish blue. So I was a little anxious that maybe this wasn't the same outfit, that maybe we were going in the wrong direction. So when that package came, I was, again, uncomfortable with even opening it, because I thought I was on the right track, but I didn't want to be wrong. I opened up the box, and sure enough, it had a purplish coloration to it. So it kind of gave me a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling there that I might have the right color anyway.
Fibers were pulled from the red cotton skirt and the blue acrylic sweater. A thorough analysis of the fibers from the outfit indicated an identical match with the fibers from Hughes's car. From the red cotton threads to the blue acrylic yarns to the yellow cross threads from the plaid skirt, the duplicate Big Bird outfit matched in every respect with the car fibers.
What I was finding was meaningful evidence that an abduction had taken place, that in fact the victim, in all likelihood, had been in the front seat of the subject's car.
With the new evidence, the prosecution could now piece together the actions of Caleb Hughes on the night Melissa disappeared. At the party, Hughes had tried to pick up several adult women, but when they rejected him, he sought a substitute.
There you go. Smile.
Fueled by frustration and alcohol, Caleb Hughes became a desperate predator with a perverse desire. His stalking eye fell upon the children. He waited and watched until an opportunity presented itself. When it did, Caleb Hughes seized an innocent and trusting child.
Hey, Melissa. Hey. Remember me? Come here.
By abducting Melissa Brannen, Hughes had crossed the boundary into the unspeakable.
We got to We should catch up with each other. We don't.
The analysis of the duplicate Big Bird outfit produced compelling evidence. It would be a powerful tool in the case against a man who investigators felt was a ruthless child molester and murderer. But Agent Diedrich had to convince the jury how incredibly unlikely it would be that these fibers had come from any source other than Melissa's outfit. He began asking people at the FBI to give him any items they may have made of navy blue acrylic. He collected more than 100.
And the objective was to see, do the fibers that I found in the front seat of Cal Hughes' car, do they match any of these? The answer was no.
From the items, Diedrich collected 126 different acrylic fibers. He made 7,983 comparison tests with those fibers against the ones found in Hughes's car. Out of almost 8,000 tests, only one succeeded in making an exact microscopic match with the blue acrylic fibers found in Hughes's car. And that was the duplicate Big Bird outfit.
Whenever you match two things, it has a lot of significance. These aren't random events. These, in most cases, occur. Is it possible? You can't deny the possibility that it could be a coincidence. But after looking at this stuff for a lot of years, I'm not a big believer in coincidence.
3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, as investigators made final preparations for the case, a stunning development occurred. They received a phone call. 2 counties away, police had just found the body of a child on the median strip of Interstate 95.
I'll be right there.
I called Weldon. We got in his car, and there was absolutely no doubt in my mind that that was going to be it, because Hughes knew that area, spent time down in that area. I said, wow, this is going to be it.
That section of median on I-95 is wide and densely wooded. It would have been easy for Hughes to pull over, hide the body among the thick vegetation, and drive off unnoticed, and there would be little chance of someone finding the remains. But someone found a body. Was it Melissa's? If it was Melissa Brannen's body in the highway median, Fairfax County Commonwealth Attorney Robert Horan felt he could put Hughes behind bars on murder one charges. His hopes were high, but they were soon dashed.
As soon as we got there, as soon as I saw it, I knew it wasn't Melissa Brannen, because the skeleton had rings on 3 fingers. But it was a young girl. She's 13, 14-year-old who had been in that media for 2 growing seasons.
The young girl's body was never identified. Finally, nearly 1 year after Melissa's disappearance, Hughes was arrested on a grand jury indictment for abducting Melissa Brannen. He was transferred from the Prince William County Jail to the Fairfax County Jail. Moran had delayed the indictment for several months in the hope that Melissa's body would be found.
By then, I know we were all pretty satisfied that the worst had happened to the child. Unfortunately, under Virginia law, you can charge somebody with murder without the body, but you have to be able to prove where the murder occurred. And of course, without the body in this case, we had no way of proving where it occurred, so we couldn't charge him with murder.
Abduction with intent to defile was the strongest case that could be brought against him. Hughes pleaded not guilty. Few people in Fairfax County believed that Melissa could still be alive, but everyone, most of all Tammy Brannen, needed to know what had happened and needed to see justice served.
Because it's tremendously important that the family of that child had definitive answers, that they know what happened to their child, even if the news is not pleasant. They need to understand exactly with concrete information what happened to their child. They need to be able to have a closure. They need to be able to give that child the burial that they deserve and go on with their lives.
With Agent Diedrich's airtight analysis of the trace evidence, Robert Horan went into the trial confident that he could convince the jury beyond reasonable doubt. The trial began on February 26, 1991. chief part of Horan's strategy was depicting Hughes' deviant sexual behavior at the party. He produced several female witnesses who recalled the crude, vulgar sexual propositions he had made to them, and others who testified he had spent considerable time playing with Melissa and had been talking to her just before she disappeared. His behavior was even more extreme, trying to eliminate the evidence. Washing his clothes, his leather belt, his shoes. He could not account for the fresh cuts on the soles of his shoes. Nor could he account for his whereabouts for the 2.5 hours between leaving the party and arriving home.
But the problem for the defense is somehow you had to explain that time. And there was never an explanation. I mean, it would have gutted our case. Our case is over if you can explain any of that time.
Though tests for blood on the shoes had proved inconclusive, the prosecution was now able to show the jury the exact matches made between the rabbit hairs, the head hair, and the fibers found in Hughes's car. Nonetheless, the defense argued that all of the fiber and hair evidence was purely circumstantial.
It may be circumstantial, but it is powerful circumstantial evidence because it doesn't change.
In order to obtain the maximum sentence for Hughes, Brannen needed to convince the jury that Hughes had intended to defile Melissa once he had her in his car.
And the only way the fibers from her outfit would have been found on the seat is that her coat had been removed while she was in that car.
The prosecution charged that Hughes could only have removed Melissa's coat for one purpose, an attempt to defile.
The true answer is that that 5-year-old was seated against her will in the front seat of that vehicle.
Caleb Hughes's trial lasted 8 days. After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of abducting Melissa Brannen with intent to defile. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
For the family members, it can't end because of the eternal hope, if you will, that someday this child that's never been seen, never been found, this child someday will appear. You know, and that's hard stuff. That is hard stuff.
Caleb Hughes is still serving his sentence today, and the body of Melissa Brannen has never been found. Eventually, Tammy Brannen moved from the Woodside apartment complex, but she never changed the telephone number that Melissa had memorized by heart, hoping that one day a call might come.